Arataka Reigen. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I don't even know where to start with this guy. If you've been on the internet in any capacity for the last few years, then Reigen's reputation might precede him. Since the original airing of the anime in 2016, Reigen's internet presence has evolved him from a fictional character to something of a phenomenon. A symbol, if you will. He is undoubtedly the most popular character in the series, Sorry Mob, and his cultural impact is vast and unmeasurable. But that's a topic for someone else to discuss. Now, I'm simply focusing on Reigen within the context of the show itself. Reigen is considered by many to be one of the best written characters in Mob Psycho. Hell, I've even seen people say that he's one of the best written characters in any anime they've seen. Even the author himself has said that Reigen is the character he's felt most emotionally attached to from the beginning. And that's not without good reason. Despite his surface-level appearance as a shady fraud who manipulates our young protagonist Shigeo to his own advantage, Reigen has a lot of nuance to the way he's written. I know I said in my last video that I was gonna let Mob Psycho off the hook for the foreseeable future, but, that was a lie. In truth, I just don't think it's possible to discuss platonic love and how it's depicted in the series at all without talking about Reigen. Because while Mob is both the protagonist and namesake of this series, this goofy scam artist, as we'll see later on, represents what it stands for at a level that is just as fundamental. But I'm not gonna convince you with 10 minutes of preamble, so let's take a crack at this guy. Reigen is actually the first character we're introduced to in the series. The first episode is even named after him, with Mob as the subtitle. He runs a business known as Spirits and Such Consultation Office, which deals in a variety of supernatural odd jobs for a not-so-modest price. The only little roadblock is the fact that Reigen has no supernatural powers whatsoever, so for the jobs that involve actual spirits, he calls on the help of his 14-year-old apprentice Mob and pays him with 300 yen per shift, which is less than the legal Japanese minimum wage as of 2012. Despite Reigen's total lack of psychic ability, Mob is apparently oblivious to this and appears to trust him a great deal, having known Reigen for 4 years. He also consistently addresses him as Shisho or Master. But even when he does ask questions about his alleged powers, Reigen is quick to talk his way out of answering honestly. Because while Reigen may be absolutely bereft of any real supernatural ability, what he does have is a great deal of charisma and social skills, like to an almost comical level, making him a polar opposite to the socially inept Mob. Now, with all this in mind, most people upon watching the show for the first time will think Reigen's an asshole, but it becomes increasingly clear that this isn't true as the season goes on. It's even clear pretty early on that while Reigen may lie about being a real psychic, he's still able to help the majority of his clients with his own skills alone. And while he may use Mob to get rid of the problems that require actual psychic intervention, it's not like he's a downright heartless bastard toward his student at all. In fact, the two right off the bat make for a really fun and dynamic duo, not only in the comedic way, but you also get the sense that they've known each other for quite some time with the dynamic they already have. Reigen kinda comes across as an older brother slash mentor slash weird uncle to Mob, and their on-screen interactions are really silly and fun. The very first indication that Reigen holds any sort of care or regard toward Mob's well-being is in the first episode. The spirit Mob is trying to exorcise in one scene tells him that it's being used by a bigger, larger spirit further down the tunnel they're in, so Mob goes down to investigate. The smaller spirit tries to stop him, saying it's too dangerous, and tells Reigen specifically that if he cares for Mob at all, then he should tell him to come back, which Reigen does after a moment of hesitation. But it all goes well, they go out for ramen afterwards, and the episode ends. This scene may be small, but it's one of the first instances where Reigen shows the side of himself that is unselfish and genuinely caring, which is something we'll see a lot more of later. It's established pretty early on that Reigen keeps Mob around under the guise that he's helping him control his powers. Now, we as the audience know that that's impossible. Reigen has no powers himself, so there's no way he understands the struggle Mob has with his powers and their link to his emotions. But that doesn't stop Reigen from giving him advice, quite often in fact, and whether it comes from a place of authenticity or not, it's often quite beneficial to him. Like when Reigen assures him that getting rid of LOL was the right thing to do, and that he's the protagonist of his own life so he shouldn't worry about what others think of him. Or when he tells him not to join a club just because he feels pressured to. It's in these little scenes of back and forth between the two of them that we really start to see the good show more in Reigen, and also where we see the groundwork be laid for some of the show's most significant themes. Perhaps one of the pieces of advice that Mob holds most to heart is the principle that he must never use his powers against someone else. We first hear Reigen say this in the very first episode, but it's a value that Mob has held up since he was a child, as shown during his standoff with Teru. It's something that Mob has clearly internalized, if not because of Reigen's guidance, then as a result of his past experience of accidentally hurting his brother with his powers. It's to such an extent that he becomes devastated after unconsciously hurting Teru, even though the circumstances by which that happened were pretty much entirely out of his control. Teru was the one attacking him, and relentlessly so. It's here Mob learns that there are some circumstances that will require him to hurt others, whether for his own preservation or to protect someone else. Put a pin in that. Mob tells Reigen about this later, but Reigen is quick to point out that even if he unconsciously hurt Teru once, he still used his powers to help plenty more people, and it's not fair of him to punish something that's such a big part of himself for just one mistake. The plot progresses from this point without much Reigen intervention, at least for a little while. Worth noting is this one scene where he saves Mob from getting scammed by basically scamming the scammers back. It's not an important scene by any means, but it's little scenes like this where Reigen is just allowed to be Reigen, where the writing in the series is some of its strongest. Aside from all the deep stuff I'm going to go into about his relationship with Mob and his unique viewpoint of the world, Reigen is honestly just a really fun character to watch on screen. I haven't talked about the comedy writing in this series all that much, but its style is top-notch. Mob Psycho thrives when it allows itself to be absurd and over the top, and Reigen's moments really represent how great it is at making those opportunities for itself, even sans all the psychic powers and stuff. But back to the plot. Ritsu, after awakening to psychic powers himself, gets kidnapped by an organization known as Claw. Mob, Teru, and Dimple track down his kidnappers and attempt to storm their compound, but only get so far before being apprehended again. Mob has to use his powers to hurt a number of people in his attempt. Meanwhile, Reigen, who actually got Mob's phone for him in the first place, notices that his apprentice is in the middle of nowhere and not answering his calls. So, like any sensible person, he takes a taxi to the middle of the forest on a hunch. While he's initially stopped by a group of Claw henchmen from entering the building itself, he manages to fool them into thinking that he's the organization's boss through sheer confidence and bullshittery. He even convinces them to stop, kidnapping middle schoolers just to follow orders. He eventually finds Mob, Ritsu, and Teru being held in the facility.
来たか。また大人数でゾロゾロと。よモブ、お前こんなところで何やってんだよ。お、弟も一緒じゃねえか。どうした？何者なんだあんた。影山兄弟と知り合いなのか。
Reigen tells the henchmen to set the three of them free, his logic being that kidnapping people is illegal. The plan goes smoothly until they run into the upper echelon of the division, Sakurai, Matsuo, and Muraki, along with its leader, a masked figure known as Ishiguro. Ishiguro is quick to call Reigen on his bullshit, and they attempt to crush Mob with their powers when he tries to attack them, only to be blown over by the force of Reigen's signature anti-Esper dropkick. Reigen then reminds Mob that he shouldn't use his powers against others. Ritsu defends him, saying that he only did so to save him, and Reigen realizes just how much stress Mob has been put through already. In retaliation, Reigen insults the rest of the upper echelon, telling them to stop putting so much stress on a kid who hates fighting like Mob. Obviously, they aren't willing to listen to him, though. So he pretends to hypnotize Muraki and then punches him in the face instead, which only works to anger them more. Ishiguro regains their footing and threatens to show them just how much power they have at their fingertips. With this, Reigen realizes how truly out of his element he is here. Though he's confident he has the ability to win any argument, that only applies to people who are mature enough to listen to reason. These Claw members, who are seriously convinced they could take over the world, are no more than children in their rationality. Not to mention they consider non-psychics to be innately lesser than them, so Reigen doesn't even have a chance of getting them to listen to him. Reigen tells Mob that they need to flee, but they don't make it out before Ishiguro stops them, nearly tearing the building in two with the force of their power. Sakurai, Muraki, and Matsuo take to fighting Ritsu and Teru at the same time, who quickly realize that they're not capable of beating these guys on their own. They need Mob's help, despite how adamant Reigen is against him fighting. Mob is overwhelmed by the pressure at this point. His friends are turning to him to save them, and he's rapidly becoming closer and closer to exploding with an emotion he's never had to grapple with before: killing intent. And, well, I don't think I can adequately describe this next scene on my own.
やめとけモブ、お前が苦しくなるだけだ。嫌な時はな、逃げたっていいんだよ。
This, in my opinion, is one of the most essential scenes in showing just why Reigen is not only such an important person to Mob, but a good person too. It's incredibly common in anime, or any media centered around a teen for that matter, to not question itself in having such a young protagonist saddled with larger-than-life problems. Chances are it may have some sort of commentary on the matter, but very rarely will you see a character just outright call BS on the notion entirely. And for the better part of this arc in particular, Mob Psycho doesn't question that either. It lets you build up your suspension of disbelief regarding this fact, only for Reigen to tear it down in this very scene. He knows Mob doesn't like fighting, and that Mob would be hurt if it came to a point where he would have to stoop to that level. So he simply tells him that he doesn't have to do it, despite how dire the situation may be. The next episode features the names of both Mob and Reigen in the main title, in contrast to the first episode. It starts with a flashback to the time Mob first met Reigen, when he was 10 years old and Reigen was 23 or so. Mob first went to him with the question of how better to control his powers. Though Reigen believes Mob is probably just some kid with an overactive imagination, he humors him and gives him some advice anyway. He tells Mob that psychic powers do not make a person different from everyone else, just like any other trait or talent someone can have. What really matters in interacting with others is being a good person, as that is what truly makes someone charming. Though it may be something that Reigen just came up with on the spot, Mob is deeply affected by his words. This is likely the first time Mob has had someone not only take him seriously, but also attempt to help him deal with his problems that came with being a psychic. And once he demonstrates his powers to him on a whim, Reigen decides to let him return to the office to help him train more. Back to the present. Reigen, immediately after stopping Mob's explosion, is cut down by Sakurai's psychically sharpened sword. And he dies. That's the end of the show, guys. I hope you liked it. No, sorry, I lied. It turns out the force of Reigen's reassuring words to Mob ended up affecting him on such a deep level as to allow his powers to be channeled into a whole new emotion, gratitude, and tenfold. And since Mob interpreted Reigen's simple advice of "it's okay to run away" to mean "it's okay to leave it to me," he ended up subconsciously transferring all that repressed power temporarily to Reigen instead. Thus Reigen gets up completely fine, baffling the four espers they're faced off with. With his newfound power, he's able to deflect Ishigero's attacks with ease, and accidentally slams him into a wall in the process. He's also able to seamlessly exercise Matsuo's spirits, dissolve Maraki's clones, and brush off Sakurai's melee strikes. This puts him on equal footing with the psychics, at least in their mind, which gives him the opportunity to speak to them and have them actually listen. This results in what I consider to be one of the best written scenes in the show. In just a few minutes, Reigen uses his charisma and argument skills to single-handedly dismantle Sakurai and Maraki's skewed worldview. He tears it down piece by piece, showing them how stupid and immature their logic is by refusing to consider taking them seriously at all. And through this, he reinforces the idea he told Mob during their first meeting, that psychic powers don't make someone any more special than everyone else in the world. Only where that logic was used to help Mob accept himself back then, now he's using it to drag these villains back to reality. It's an insanely good scene in the way it both reinforces the story's themes and characterizes Reigen as both a morally good person and a well-spoken, silver-tongued salesman. The now unmasked Ishiguro comes back to deny that anything Reigen is saying is true, but Mob shoots him down again by simply echoing the sentiment of powers not making someone special. Ishiguro responds to this by attempting to destroy the facility with all of them inside, but he's stopped by a random claw-aligned kid named Sho, who then promptly disappears and will probably never come up in this video again, sorry. Dimple comes back, now visible to Reigen, Claw is defeated, and the season ends. Hooray! Episode 1 of Season 2 doesn't have Reigen much at all. Him and Mob fight an evil spirit at the beginning, and the spirit comments on Reigen's lack of powers to Mob's face, but he doesn't react or respond. Much of early Season 2 is just focused on the shenanigans of Mob, Reigen, and Dimple, without much significant or of consequence happening. Episode 3 has one scene where Reigen becomes guilty for putting so much pressure on Mob through the amount of jobs he's taking on, which causes him to throw salt at a group of clients who are stressing him out, but that's mostly it. His relationship with Dimple is reinforced in a couple one-on-one scenes between them as well. He doesn't do much in the Mogami arc either, aside from initially deducing the truth behind Minori's possession, and deliberately choosing to stay behind with Mob while he is unconscious and inside Minori's mind in spite of the danger Mogami poses. Reigen also refuses to accept the payment from Minori's rich father for saving her, saying that it doesn't feel like a success because of how many people got hurt by Mogami. But yeah, not much else worth noting here. Let's see what's next. Probably nothing too. I decided to make this part its own section, as there's a lot to say about Reigen's characterization in this part of the story. It's also one of the few arcs that focuses centrally on a character other than Mob himself for such a large chunk of time. It starts with a flashback that shows Reigen quitting his old, boring job as a water cooler salesman. Directionless and not particularly passionate or good at anything, he buys an office space on a whim, and supposedly gets the idea to become a psychic after seeing a random ad in the back of a magazine. Then, curiously, we go back to Mob's point of view. He's clearly in a better place than he was at the start of the series. He's made progress with his exercise with the help of the Body Improvement Club and made friends with them in the Telepathy Club too. He's about to go out for food and karaoke to celebrate two of the members' birthdays when suddenly he gets a call from Reigen out of the blue, who insists he needs some help with a job. Mob reluctantly leaves and helps him exorcise the spirit, but expresses his displeasure at Reigen's abrupt call afterward, claiming that even he has friends in a private life. Reigen teases him about it, saying that he's probably just being taken advantage of by the people he calls his friends. If they're getting in the way of his job, then that's proof that they don't really care about him at all, and are just keeping him around to make fun of him. Now this is a lot for Reigen to say just out of nowhere like that. As a matter of fact, this part wasn't originally in the manga at all, which has sparked a lot of debate about whether it's in character for Reigen to say or not, or whether it's necessary to include for what this arc is trying to show about him. I personally think it was worth including. While Reigen has been shown to be a much better person throughout the series despite his initial impression as a scam artist, he's still selfish on some level, and he's perfectly capable of using his talent of speech to hurt others. It also has the added benefit of showing Reigen's own insecurities, but I'll get back to that in a bit. Mob denies this and Reigen tries to backtrack, realizing he probably overstepped. But Mob continues, saying that he's starting to understand that not everything Reigen says is true, and that he's grown enough to know that he's not being mocked or taken advantage of by his friends. Reigen's efforts to go back on his word ultimately fail. Mob doesn't show up to work the next day. But Reigen isn't too concerned about it at first, as he thinks Mob probably doesn't have anyone else who he can talk about his problems to, and that he'll be back in no time. I think the most important thing about this situation is that it establishes without a shadow of a doubt that Reigen is the one in the wrong here. He hurt Mob, and thus he is the one who has to work to mend the rift in their relationship by realizing his own mistakes. Mob is perfectly justified in just sitting by and leaving Reigen be for a little while. The rest of this arc wouldn't work if you didn't establish this right off the bat. Back at home, Mob doesn't completely detest Reigen, he's just decided it's better for him to take a break so he can stop blindly following him and relying on him all the time, and instead devote more time to what he wants to do. Reigen is able to manage his business well enough without Mob's help. He was the one who started it from the ground up after all. He's optimistic until he sees Mob out in public one day, walking with his two friends and seemingly having plenty of fun on his own. Reigen is shocked to discover Mob actually does have a social life. In fact, it turns out the real social recluse this whole time was Reigen himself. He remembers back at home later that it's his 28th birthday, but he didn't receive one message about it from anyone, except for his mother, who just passive-aggressively told him that he should get a real job. You're probably wondering about Reigen's family at this point, but this is pretty much the only time we see or hear about them in the actual series. We know from the fanbook that he does have a father and older sister, but neither of them are in contact with him. We can safely assume from this that his relationship with his family probably isn't all that great. As far as we know, Reigen has never been romantically involved with anyone either, nor has he ever shown interest in anyone in that way. The amount of times he's even been called by his first name can be counted on one hand. He tries to go celebrate his birthday by getting a drink with some regulars at a bar he frequents, but it becomes clear to him that they don't see him as their friend either, and they're just using his advice for their own sake. Reigen truly has no real friends. He was basically just projecting all of his insecurities onto Mob that day, and that very mistake is ironically the reason why he's more alone than ever now. Reigen throws up all his drinks from the night and has an identity crisis in a back alley. The artificial light of the streetlight above scrutinizes him. If he has no friends and is making no lasting impact on the world, then who even is he? Realizing he's spiraling down a very dangerous path, Reigen decides to, in his own words, become somebody. The next day, he chooses to focus on expanding his business. He strives to improve what he's good at and hone in on the jobs he can accomplish without Mob. He broadens his frame of work and accepts more and more jobs over the weeks, and eventually his popularity reaches such a point where he's invited to be on live TV. It backfires supremely, however. Reigen ends up being exposed as a fraud on the show, and his humiliating display makes his popularity skyrocket in the worst way possible. He becomes a public enemy across internet and media platforms. His former clients, even the ones he's helped, want nothing to do with him. Even the regulars at the bar turn their backs on him when he asks for help clearing his name. The only one who doesn't know about Reigen's newly acquired infamy is ironically Mob, just because he's super out of touch when it comes to that sort of thing. Now, let me get one thing clear, the sheer level of popularity and humiliation that Reigen experiences at this part of the story seems pretty damn exaggerated. The idea of a fraud psychic, no matter how popular, becoming a public pariah on such a widespread level is pretty outlandish. But it's worth it to suspend your disbelief to just bask in the hilarity of the fact that Reigen basically gets cancelled on Twitter within the actual Mob Psycho universe. The show also goes really over the top in trying to convince you of this and actually show the repercussions of his downfall, so I don't think it's really that big of a problem. Reigen decides he's had enough when he finds a group of reporters staking out his house and decides to hold a press conference to address the allegations against him. He goes to it a few days later and quickly becomes tired of the journalists interrogating him and not even giving him a chance to debate. Despite this, he's able to answer the reporters' questions without much of a problem, up until one of them brings up his high school graduation essay in which he expressed his desire to become somebody. Once again, he's underneath the streetlight in the alleyway. Even though he may have expanded his business and gotten at least some of the recognition he desires, none of it was really worth the trouble it brought him in the end. So why did Reigen even become a psychic anyway? He only did it because he was bored of his old job and he actually intended to quit years ago, so why didn't he? The answer we get comes in the form of the flashback of Reigen and Mob meeting once again, only this time from Reigen's perspective. Reigen was initially pretty bored of his job as a psychic and skeptical of Mob's powers in the first place, but then he realized how deeply Mob was affected by the simple advice he gave him on the whim, and saw a potential in him that Reigen never really saw in himself. So he became Mob's mentor, hoping that he could help him in meeting that potential. What this means is, essentially, his position as Mob's mentor was ultimately the thing that ended up giving Reigen's life the meaning he'd always been looking for. Even if he wasn't able to change the world or something like that, he was able to become somebody in the eyes of this boy he found himself admiring, and in the end, that alone turned out to be enough. The ending cinematic in the first season kind of foreshadows this, depicting Reigen's life in a monochrome glass painting which gains color as he meets Mob. This is referenced later in the ending of the third season, which symbolizes Mob's character arc of learning to accept himself and find his own meaning in life. But Reigen realizes he messed everything up by refusing to acknowledge Mob's growth, even after knowing him for so long, and holding him back from enjoying his youth by taking advantage of him being around. Despite his goal of becoming someone Mob could look up to and rely on, he was too selfish to care about Mob's actual progress. So, in an attempt to apologize, Reigen stops answering the questions he's being asked, and instead tells Mob that he really has grown up. The reporters erupt in protest, asking what that means and demanding that he actually answer and come clean about his actions. When suddenly the room begins to shake and all the equipment begins to miraculously rise into the air. Reigen remains calm and feigns ignorance, while all the reporters assume that this is actually a display of his psychic powers. While Reigen doesn't actually say this, he's perfectly content in letting them think that, and basically all but flips them the bird before leaving. On the way home, Reigen finds Mob and Dimple waiting for him at a bridge. And I'm sorry to show so many scenes back to back, but I sincerely don't think I can do this part justice by just describing it.
お前知ってる？
何をですか？
俺の正体。ネットとか雑誌とか見てねえの？
そんなの知ってましたよ、最初から。僕の師匠の正体は。いいやつだ。
This scene is honestly just amazing. You can tell clearly that Reigen doesn't really expect Mob to forgive him at all, and is visually about to tear up when he hears Mob's words. The light of the sun, which throughout the arc is used to symbolize Reigen's desire to become important, illuminates him from behind. The three of them go to get ramen, and the episode ends with Mob wishing Reigen a happy birthday. Mob and Reigen really are the characters that make Mob Psycho what it is. Not only does their on-screen dynamic make the series really entertaining to watch, but their relationship is emotionally compelling and resonant. It's honestly really rare that you'll see such a well-developed platonic interpersonal relationship on TV nowadays. They clearly hold a lot of admiration and love for one another, even if they're a pretty unorthodox pair. The separation arc is fantastic in the way it develops this. It resolves a lot of the problems that exist in the relationship between Reigen and Mob, especially earlier in the series, so that the two can be on more equal and healthy footing as the series continues. It's worth mentioning that Mob's line of knowing the entire time does imply that Mob has known the truth about Reigen's lack of power since the beginning. And while that very well may be the case, at least on a subconscious level, Reigen has not yet come clean about his lack of psychic abilities with Mob face to face just yet. That very well may be the last obstacle of trust in Mob that Reigen has yet to overcome. Not that it'll be important later on or anything. Man, what was I talking about again? Oh, yeah. Right off the bat, we see the consequences of Reigen accepting Mob's growth when he closes the office to help him practice for his school marathon. He even shows up to it in person and runs with Mob for part of it until Mob passes out from exhaustion in the middle. We see Reigen next after Mob's house burns down. It turns out his office was burned down too, and all the espers in town have chosen to gather up with him to try to stop Claw. I mentioned this part in my last video, but after he hears Dimple's lie about Mob's family being out of harm's way, he warns Dimple against letting Mob discover his dishonesty, but ultimately still goes along with the lie for Mob's peace of mind. Mob trusts his word so much that he lets himself pass out right then and there. Because of his display back at the 7th Division, the rest of the former Claw members and other espers defer to Reigen to decide what to do next to stop Claw. Reigen, however, doesn't accept that responsibility and instead tells them to leave it to the police. It's easy to interpret this choice as selfish, but the threat at hand is already beginning to destroy the city. I think it's more that Reigen is ready to put a bunch of people who are currently following him in danger. He acknowledges to himself that he thought they might have a chance with Mob, but he's not about to risk it while Mob's unconscious. But he changes his mind once he finds out his insurance won't cover the cost of the office fire if it was caused by psychic powers, so maybe he is at least a little bit self-interested. He makes a plan for all the espers in the group to attack Suzuki and the rest of Claw while he stays behind with Dimple to make sure Mob doesn't wake up alone and confused. Unfortunately, they end up being attacked by one of Claw's most elite fighters, and in a thoroughly entertaining and unconventional fight scene, Reigen and Dimple must figure out how to get away from the guy without letting Mob get hurt. Despite their best efforts, Mob eventually ends up getting hurled across the city, but eventually wakes up and begins making his way toward the tower where Suzuki has taken refuge. There's one interaction I want to point out here where Mob finds a group of Claw henchmen looting a wrecked store on his way. In a rare moment of boldness, he lectures the group for what they're doing, saying it's selfish to take advantage of the resources that other people provide for them. The scene very clearly exists to help set up the people need other people theme that is most predominant in this arc, but I think it's worth noting how distinctly Reigen-like both this message and its delivery is. Even if Mob isn't repeating his mentor's words verbatim, his influence definitely shows in the essence of his message and the confidence. Mob probably wouldn't be able to do something so bold if not for his efforts to become more confident and Reigen's influence, so I think it's worth noting. Reigen disappears for a little while Mob makes his trek to Suzuki's tower. Right when he reunites with his allies, though, he encounters the blind esper Shimazaki. His deceivingly simple powers of teleportation and inhuman reflexes make for a fierce foe, as well as his sole reliance on auras to better track his enemies. So far, no one has been able to defeat him, even Teru with the help of all the former Claw espers. Mob is about to confront him when suddenly Reigen shows up and punches Shimazaki in the face a ton of times, justifying it by shouting that it's self-defense. Shimazaki, horrified at the possibility of an esper being able to conceal their aura and thus pose as a perfect enemy to him, teleports out of sight and disappears. Thus, Reigen seamlessly saves the day once again. Now that everyone is back together, it's time for Mob to finally go fight Suzuki. He insists on going alone, even turning down the help of Ritsu and Reigen, but Reigen still sends Dimple after him to make sure he's okay. While he's in the tower, he comes across Suzuki's bodyguard, Serizawa. And I guess this means it's finally time to talk about Serizawa now. Katsuya Serizawa is introduced late in season 2, and he later becomes a tertiary character to the main cast. But when he's introduced, he's working as a bodyguard and right-hand man to Claw's boss, Toichiro Suzuki. It may seem like I'm going on a tangent here, but I'll get to why it's important in a sec, trust me. Serizawa has had psychic powers since his adolescence, but he became a hikikomori around that time due to his fear of his powers accidentally hurting someone. He stayed that way for 15 years, into his late 20s, but he emerged from his room when Suzuki, a psychic himself, gave him an umbrella for security and offered to help him control his powers and reintegrate into society. Instead, though, Suzuki basically used Serizawa for his powers for years, manipulating him by making him think he was the president of a company and ultimately making his well-being entirely dependent on both Suzuki himself and the umbrella. Mob initially tries to fight Serizawa, saying that his naivete is not an excuse to let himself be used for such awful things. At this point, you can see pretty clearly that Serizawa and Suzuki are meant to be a parallel to Mob and Reigen in some ways, so I think it's worth analyzing for that purpose. Now, most clearer parallels are between Serizawa and Mob rather than Reigen and Suzuki. They both had a time in their life when they felt isolated due to their experience with their powers, and the point is supposed to be that Mob could have very realistically fallen victim to the manipulation of someone like Suzuki had their circumstances been reversed. It's why Mob is able to really empathize with Serizawa and convince him that he's just being used. In that way, the distinct difference between the two lies in the person they met who offered to help them control their powers. It is true that Reigen originally took Mob under his wing with the intention of exploiting his powers for his business. Well, that was his partial reason at least. Dimple even points out the irony in Mob criticizing Suzuki for taking advantage of Serizawa's powers. But unlike Suzuki, Reigen actually stayed true to his word and helped Mob control his powers, or at least helped him improve his perspective on them. And rather than make Mob entirely dependent on him for help, he advised Mob to be more accepting of himself and be the protagonist of his own life. Even in the moments where he found himself holding Mob back, Reigen acknowledged that what he was doing was wrong. There's also a brief eye-catcher in the same episode that shows Serizawa and Suzuki, and then Mob and Reigen, with one of both of them holding umbrellas and standing in the rain. This symbolizes how Suzuki doesn't need Serizawa as much as Serizawa needs him. Suzuki even mentions that he would be fine by himself if all of his allies died, in the contrasting way that Mob and Reigen both rely on one another to learn and grow. God, I'm starting to word this like an essay on an AP exam. Serizawa realizes his wrongdoing and lets Mob pass. Finally, Mob is able to confront Suzuki, and at first tries to reason with him and stop him from fighting his son, Sho. Oh, guess I was wrong. Suzuki doesn't listen, though. Instead, he beats Mob brutally and only takes pause when Reigen appears, pointing a gun at him. The gun is fake. Reigen can't use it since it belongs to Sakurai, but it's enough to get Suzuki to stop and listen to what Reigen has to say. Reigen apologizes to Mob for letting him go confront something so big on his own. His mind was too clouded by the situation to realize that it was too dangerous for Mob to deal with on his own. Once Mob passes out, Reigen proposes to join forces with Suzuki and convince Mob to let him finish what he's setting out to achieve. He tells Suzuki he has multiple different plans of defeating him if he doesn't go along with this, but in reality he's just using this as a distraction to get close enough to punch him in the face. This only works to anger Suzuki more though, and Reigen is just barely saved from the force of his ire by Serizawa, whose umbrella burns away in Suzuki's fire. At this point, Mob is angry enough to fight Suzuki on his own. Serizawa, Sho, and Reigen make it to safe ground while the two duke it out. They have their battle as Suzuki's power output gradually increases, but it eventually reaches a point where not even Suzuki himself can control it anymore. Mob, already wounded, runs to tell his friends to flee before it causes an explosion. By the time Reigen realizes that Mob isn't following them, it's already too late. Mob goes back, staying by Suzuki's side out of simple kindness. When Suzuki asks him why, he echoes the sentiment that Reigen told him all the way back in the beginning of Season 1.
お前の人生の主役はお前だろ?
僕の人生の主役は僕だから。
He attempts to help Suzuki control the explosion by absorbing some of the energy into his own body. It works, to an extent. There's still an explosion. For a moment, it's clear that Reigen very well believes Mob may have been killed by it. But he wasn't, and Reigen finds Mob in the explosion-born broccoli with the help of Dimple, Teru, and Ritsu. The season ends with Reigen hiring Serizawa to work at spirits and such. Final stretch, baby! Serizawa is getting adjusted to his new job alongside Reigen and Mob, happy to have been given the opportunity to work there while reintegrating into society. As iconic of a duo Reigen and Mob may be, Serizawa fits into the dynamic really well. Honestly, the only problem I have with his writing is that he's not featured in the season as much as I think he could have been, but whatever. Reigen takes a backseat in the Divine Tree arc for the most part. He forms the plan for Mob and Ritsu to get rid of the Divine Tree by floating it up and dropping it into the ocean. Reigen is, as far as Mob knows, the last person to get brainwashed by Psycho Helmet in the entire city. And much like the rest of the build-up in this arc, this scene is eerie as hell. You can tell almost immediately that something is wrong once Reigen starts talking, and it's clear Mob can too. Though his speaking manner is just as smooth and composed as ever, he comes off much more condescending than usual, which seems out of character for him, especially in the wake of the separation arc. As if alluding to this scene takes place right underneath the bridge where Reigen met Mob after the press conference. Even if he catches on to the brainwashing, Mob is deeply unsettled by this. Not having Reigen as an ally in this situation means he is thoroughly and utterly alone, which is never something he's had to deal with before. The next time we see him after this arc is the telepathy arc. Reigen asks Serizawa out to get drinks on New Year's Eve, but is turned down as Serizawa is already going out with his friends from night school. It's still a very friendly gesture though, especially keeping in mind that Serizawa is probably one of the first friends his age that Reigen has had in a while. Reigen reluctantly agrees to drive Mob and his friends in the telepathy club up a mountain on New Year's Eve so that they can make contact with aliens. He even rents a car just so they can. Considering the fact that Reigen was the one holding Mob back from hanging out with those very same friends, it's really sweet seeing him help Mob make memories with them. And finally, that brings us to the final arc in the story. Nothing bad will happen. It begins with Mob finding out that his crush Tsubomi is transferring to another school in the near future, so he decides to finally take his chance to confess to her, bringing a bouquet of flowers on the way. Then he's hit by a car. And just like what happened with Teru and with the other high school boys that attacked him and Ritsu when he was young, the unconscious, suppressed form of his powers, which I will now be referring to as Shigeo, takes over his body and seeks to make its way to Tsubomi itself. Teru tries to stop it and fails, but in the process allows Mob to wake up within his body and begin fighting for control from Shigeo. It doesn't work though, and Shigeo only succeeds in sucking away more of Mob's control. Shigeo is basically the conscious manifestation of Mob's powers, and he despises Mob for having suppressed it for so long. The incident that caused Mob to suppress it for so long was the time he accidentally hurt Ritsu, and because of that Shigeo despises anyone he's met since then that has known Mob without knowing Shigeo. Essentially, he hates anyone besides Ritsu and Tsubomi, especially Reigen. Speak of the devil, Reigen has begun to make his way toward the disaster that Mob is causing, with Serizawa helping him not get wounded by the rebel. Shigeo trusts Reigen less than anyone else. He perceives him as having used Shigeo's powers, and by extension Shigeo himself, as a tool for his own gain. Shigeo also points out to Mob that Reigen has lied to him about his powers for years, and Mob just pretended not to notice. When Reigen approaches Shigeo's untamed form, he expects the conman to just give up on Mob and prove how much of a coward he is. But Reigen persists, even after getting hit in the head by a huge chunk of rubble. He calls out to Mob, apologizing to him for not having known the extent of what he was dealing with for so long. He begs Mob to talk to him, to slow down, but it's too hard to move with the rubble and the wreckage. The stuff I'm about to talk about may be uncomfortable for some, so I'm going to put a warning and timestamp on the screen right now. I want to pause for a second to talk about the imagery here, specifically the panel of Reigen taking off his shoes. At first glance, it's pretty inconspicuous, but it has deeper implications considering the Japanese custom of taking one's shoes off before committing suicide. Now, I'm not suggesting that Reigen intended to die in this scene, or even that he expected to, but the imagery is pretty damn intentional, and I think it's definitely supposed to convey the fact that he very well considered the possibility of dying to save Mob, and more importantly, he was, at least on some level, ready for it. Reigen, though beaten and wounded, forces his way to Mob's side. He's only able to do so by being possessed by the newly revived Dimple, and the two of them work together to get through to their friend, to Mob. Reigen uses the opportunity to tell Mob that he doesn't have psychic powers. From the beginning, everything was a lie. Miraculously, it works. Mob is allowed to come forward, and Shigeo calms down, facing Reigen with a glare that brings him to tears. He confesses everything, that he doesn't know anything about having psychic powers, that everything he advised Mob about having them was completely made up. He apologizes for acting like his master this entire time, but he says that he needs to give him one more piece of advice. That he's not alone in having two sides of him. It can happen to anyone, where they have a facet of themselves they want to hide from others. Reigen says that even he has a part of himself that he doesn't like. A part of him that smokes and manipulates others and lies to the people he loves. But it doesn't matter because his lies were what allowed Reigen to become closer to Mob, and Mob's powers were what allowed him to become the person he is now. We can't hide from the parts of ourselves that we dislike. Whether we like it or not, they're a part of who we are, and therefore we must learn to accept them. With this said, Shigeo asks Mob if he will accept him once and for all. But Mob says that, to do that, Shigeo must accept him first, the way everyone he loves has come to accept him over the years as well. Shigeo hesitates due to his fear of being rejected by Tsubomi, but Mob assures him that everything will be okay. And with that, Mob and Shigeo become one. Reigen and Dimple allow Mob to go face Tsubomi on his own, and he comes back a few minutes later, having been rejected. Instead of bottling up all his emotions, however, Mob lets himself cry, and Reigen comforts him as they go back home, telling him that this is just the beginning. Woof, yeah. While the bouquet arc is incredibly centered on Mob himself, it's even called Mob in the anime, it also wraps up Reigen's character arc. In coming clean to Mob about his lack of powers, he finally embraces his fraudulent nature by revealing it to the person who is most important to who he is today. And that final line at the end, where he says to Mob that this is only the beginning, is just so important in establishing the hopeful tone that the end of the series has. You get the sense that even though Reigen may no longer be Mob's master in the most formal sense of the word, the two will keep learning from each other in the years to come. Oh, speaking of hopeful, let's take a look at the epilogue. The epilogue ends on Reigen's 29th birthday with all the kids, Arizawa and Dimple, surprising him with a cake. It drops and Mob catapults it into Reigen's face, and the series ends with him letting out the first genuine laugh we've seen from him. Phew, that took a long time. This is definitely my longest video so far, and wait a minute. I forgot about the Reigen spin-off. Just kidding. Honestly, the Reigen spin-off volume is more of a Tomei spin-off volume. Sure, it features Reigen pretty heavily, but it's just more of his usual selfless fraud shenanigans, and I frankly don't want to have this be longer than it already is, so... If you asked me to summarize the message of the series in a single concise thesis statement, then it would probably be that Mob Psycho 100 makes a mature and nuanced case for genuine kindness and love. I think this is honestly why it isn't really as talked about as a lot of other anime. As to a lot of people, that theme may seem superficial compared to the other stuff out there. That and the unconventional art style may drive people away. But Mob Psycho bleeds kindness and ingenuity throughout its narrative, and no character represents this better than Reigen himself. Mob is kind, sure, he's a good person at his core, but Reigen very much stands out in the way he approaches the world around him with an unflinching and resolute kindness. He is overzealous, and he lies, and he makes mistakes that sometimes lead to him hurting others. But in spite of all this, he is at his core good. It's why Mob looks up to him so forthrightly, as many others who watch the show do too. That about wraps things up though. I hope this is comprehensive enough to prevent people from ever talking about Reigen ever again. I'm sick of it. I know it's cheesy as hell, but I want to close off by thanking everyone for all the positive feedback and love I got from my Dimple video. I honestly just started making video essays for my own personal fulfillment. I never expected to get so much positive attention for it, but it's been really nice nonetheless. Here's your obligatory reminder to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.